everyone, and welcome to another edition of NatCon Australia. Today, I'm very fortunate to have Stewart Paterson, who's an economist, investment banker, and an author who wrote a book which I noticed several years ago. It came out in 2018, called China Trade Power, and said some very constructive, interesting things about the trading relationship that the West has had with China over the last, let's call it 30 plus years. Stewart, I can do an intro to you, but I think it's always best if people introduce themselves because you can provide much more, well, you do it the way you want to do it. Yep. So yeah, go ahead. Who are you, and how did you come to learn and get interested in China and all that entails?
Thank you, Dan. So yeah, I wrote this book, as you say, in 2018, and that was on the back of me returning to the UK after a sort of 18-year absence, living in Asia, firstly in India, then in a decade in Hong Kong, and more latterly after that in Singapore, where I ran my own hedge fund business. And I lived in Hong Kong from sort of 1998 through to 2007, so leaving just before the global financial crisis and arriving shortly before China joined the World Trade Organization. And so I had this sort of bird's eye view of China's economic rise, particularly the sort of mercantilist drive for export supremacy, and could literally sit in my flat with a gin and tonic and watch the ships leave full and return empty. And when I returned to the United Kingdom, I thought that it was very odd that the sort of political discourse that was going on was lacking any sort of connection to what I perceive to have been the most monumental event in terms of shaping the political economy of the world, which was China's entry into the World Trade Organization, but which had facilitated her economic rise. And with that, obviously, a degree of geopolitical clout that meant that China, for the first time in a long time, was in a position to start shaping the world order, and making world institutions and governance systems more conducive to a totalitarian regime and a world order that was safe for authoritarianism, really. And to my mind, economics was at the core of this. You know, it was the mercantilism that gave China the clout, and it was a very deliberate, in my view, roadmap that was being laid out in terms of inveigling countries into asymmetric economic relationships, which meant that they would be very reluctant to push back against sort of China's assertiveness. And that was really the origin of the book. And obviously there were other social consequences of the deflation that came from China as a result of its trading prowess.
Now, you studied university in the UK, economics, as I understand. Let me hazard a guess that, when you left there, you were probably, what were your views on trade generally? And when did you start to sort of question some of the orthodoxies in relation to, that free trade is where we're all should be heading in all circumstances with all nations, and then while there might be some concessions here and there, that's the ultimate goal to which we should all sort of ascribe. I always remember vividly being in China when that debate was happening. I was in Shanghai, the debate regarding China's entry into the WTO and the permanent trading relations. It's always interesting to me, people who live through it like you do, who are on the ground there, because you don't know. It's only with perspective and looking back sometimes that you get that your views become more fully formed, right? It's hard to see where things are going when you're in the moment. So were you at the time in 2000, 2001, were you in favor of China joining the WTO, or were you
But
were you a bit?
let me take your first observation first. I mean, like everyone else, I think from my generation, we were taught sort of Ricardian trade theory, and the benefit of free trade. But my first sort of work experience, actually, in terms of when I joined the financial service industry, was looking at Japan, and that was in 1991. So the bubble had just burst, and obviously Japan, in many ways, was the role model for China's political economic sort of construct. Heavy state subsidy, industrial development through gaining critical mass in economies that in industries with dramatic economies of scale. Using access to the US market in order to build up that scale. And then to come to your point about permanent normal trade relations and China's accession into WTO, I mean, the first point I would make is that the political discourse, it's insofar as anyone was thinking about it, the opinion was being shaped by multinationals that were already in China, the Boeings of the world, Hewlett Packards, etc. And against them were the kind of motley crew of Seattle
Yeah,
protesters, a lot of whose views were dismissed at the time because we were living through this sort of triumph of neoliberalism, on the back of the success of the sort of Thatcher Reagan supply side sort of economic policies. And so there wasn't really, in the UK where I wasn't living, but obviously trade is an EU competency. And so there wasn't a national debate because it wasn't something that national governments were involved in, the formulation of trade policy. It was a European issue. And I mean, remember, Clinton was actually elected on a ticket of opposing China's accession into the World Trade Organization. It was in office the second time around that he did his U-turn, and of course it was Bush actually who was there at the accession, although obviously the groundwork had already been done. I have to admit, I as a China analyst, but a young one at the time, looking at the Chinese economy, I'm one of those people who have perennially underestimated the ability of the party state and a command economy to generate economic growth. So I was very much of the opinion that, yeah, this would be quite dramatic in its impact, but at the end of the day, because the Chinese wouldn't let go of the commanding heights of the economy, they would never rise to the kind of economic clout that they now maintain. So my culpability was in underestimating the speed with which the Chinese could bring resources to bear on the export orientating industries, and their ability to harness some of the incentive structures of a market system to build this export machine. Because remember that it's much more recently that you've seen state-owned enterprises spearheading China's overseas economic engagement. In the early years of China's economic success, it was SMEs, private sector, cutthroat competition in low value added industries, entrepreneurs taking risk, workers working incredibly hard. Yes, there were export incentives in terms of VAT rebates and special economic zones, and the state had a big hand in facilitating that through infrastructure investment and what have you. But it was an SME-led thing, and of course the multinationals themselves. I mean, people often forget that back then I think it was about almost half of Chinese exports are actually from foreign invested companies exporting from China. And of course, quite a lot of those were Taiwanese. Some of those were actually Chinese having taken capital out and reinvested back in China. But it wasn't just a Chinese industrial phenomenon. And so the story has evolved. Yeah.
When did you actually? So that, with those reservations, I remember, like I said, vividly in Shanghai, the American Chamber of Commerce in 2000. They were full of confidence. Corporate America, all the multinationals you mentioned, were sort of bestriding town like colossi, and the US dollar was very high. They'd also, it's hard to remember the context, but from a British perspective, Hong Kong had the handover had gone ahead, and while there was, misgivings about all that, and it was 3 years later, and the worst fears hadn't immediately been realized there in Hong Kong at that stage, and so there was it's probably a reasonable bet to make that, let's just bring China in, and like other countries, and we'll try. And I don't think anyone fully appreciated what releasing such an incredibly large pool of industrious labor would do to the global economy. No one did. I mean, look, they were the motley crew in Seattle, um, made up from everyone from Pat Buchanan to anarchists to Ralph Nader, those types, and they were sort of easily dismissed in a way because they weren't serious furrowed-browed economists sort of weighing the pros and cons. Everyone was getting swept along in the wave of it all, and there was, as you detail in your book, and as people like James Mann, whose book I always put in front of people, who wrote the China Fantasy. The quotes from that time were just unreal in retrospect. Bill Clinton saying democracy, we trade with China and democracy is on our side, and all of the Tony Blair, Rupert Murdoch, they were all assuming that there was just an unstoppable wave that was coming. So yeah, when did you actually, even with the misgivings, when did the penny drop and you think to yourself, okay, we need some type of trade-related adjustments here to change the relationship that the US has with China?
So I think the global financial crisis to me was
Yeah.
a key watershed, and for a number of reasons. I mean, the first was that the inability of the Federal Reserve to actually tighten monetary policy in a meaningful way because the Chinese were recycling their current account surpluses into US treasuries and suppressing the long end of the yield curve. That meant that, you can criticize the timing of Fed rate hikes or what have you. They weren't able to really raise the cost of borrowing because the Chinese were recycling their surpluses into US dollar assets. And then with the China coming through that relatively unscathed. I mean, I think their statistics probably flatter the degree to which they came through it unscathed. But there's no doubt about it. Relatively speaking, they came out of it very well. You would have expected the current account surplus to disappear, wouldn't you? Because here we have China growing faster than the rest of the world, and therefore the marginal propensity for China to import from the rest of the world should be going up, and our demand for Chinese goods should be going down. But there was no sign of a current account deficit materializing in China, which meant that no matter how bifurcated relative growth rates became between the two blocks, there was never going to be a situation in which China ran a current account deficit, which should have been, I think, enough proof that targeting a surplus was policy and targeting an undervalued currency was policy. And currency manipulation is against the explicit rules of the international trading order. And so at that stage, I think it should have been fairly apparent to people that interaction with a non-market economy of the size of China's was going to have a very distorting effect on economies that tried to allocate resources along market lines. And I don't want to be misinterpreted here. I would argue that the standard of living and the economic power that has accrued to countries that have adopted market-oriented policies is our strongest card in this competition to shape the global order of the future, because it's what populations buy into is the prospect of ever increasing living standards. The problem has come from the interaction, the melting of a market economy with a non-market economy, which has this distorting effect on resource allocation to the detriment of the market economies. And I just elaborate on that in a couple of ways. I mean, the first and most obvious one is that the structure of the market economy becomes sort of the mirror image of what the command economy wants theirs to be. So if China's prepared to dominate, say, the electric vehicle market, and they're prepared to basically spend a limitless amount of taxpayer money or state money, and no such thing as state money, but through the control of the financial intermediaries on that industry, you are not going to be a part of that industry. So your economy then has to take shape around the rest of the world economy, X that. And so the market-oriented economy is then allocating resources on a sort of second best principle. And as soon as I think you establish that, you realize that you're no longer really a market economy. Areas where capital ought to be flowing to, private profit maximizing capital ought to be flowing to, don't go there because they'll be competing against capital that has no compulsion to generate returns for its owners.
Do you think, for example, there's a lot of what a lot of people say in Australia, and I'm sure they say it elsewhere, is things were going along more or less, with bumps and all the rest of it with China. Trade policies were appropriate, and then Xi Jinping came along and he upset the apple cart, and this is why, who could have possibly predicted that? And this is why we have to now adjust things. And he's changed the direction of China completely from the days of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and those guys. And I just don't accept that proposition, because yes, he is different in some ways, but it absolves the responsibility. It's a nice get out of jail card, because how did they think the story was going to end if China continued even under a Jiang Zemin? I mean, Jiang Zemin would have shared the same goals with reunification of China, and was no friend of civil liberties, and certainly was in favor of retaining control of the commanding heights of the economy over SOEs and the like. So, my question is this: it's like even without Chinese Communist Party rule, even without Xi Jinping, even if a China ruled by Chiang Kai-shek in 2000, right, or one of his proteges, it still would have been dumping such a large labor pool on the market. Still would have had the same type of dramatic consequences, right? Still would have required a policy response in due course from the West, because otherwise, industry would just naturally continue to flow out to China to chase, to take advantage of the cheap labor and other incentives. What do you make of that? Is it a get out? Are they trying to use a get out of jail card to blame it all on Xi Jinping in the last couple of years, or is
I have a lot of sympathy with the argument you've articulated there. So coming to the politics first, I mean, I think that if you were of the view that China's political economy would change, you'd have to be of the view that the politics would change, because the party were always going to want to control the allocation of resources, not least to ensure that their patronage was intact, and that their survival was guaranteed. So I think you really have to perhaps go back to 1989 and say, well, at that juncture, there were factions in the party who actually did really want to move towards a more democratic system of government and some plurality in the party system, not necessarily a sort of democracy that we would sort of recognize as something, but definitely a sort of significant political reform. And of course, that was crushed on June the 4th. And from that juncture on, I think it was naive to believe that political reform was coming. So then the question was, could you have actually had genuine economic reform under a kind of authoritarian one-party rule, but where the party were happy to withdraw from large parts of society, maybe a la Chile under Pinochet, you might sort of draw some kind of analogy with, and that you could have a sort of a market-orientated economy operating under an authoritarian political system, and that just seems to me that it was unlikely, right? Because at the end of the day, the party's legitimacy rested on its economic outcomes at that time, and you're not likely to have the courage to say, well, our whole legitimacy rests on economic outcomes, but the way to achieve those economic outcomes is for us to actually let go of control of the levers that are going to be that are either going to deliver it or not, right? And therefore, the whole party state's future would be kind of up in the air. And so I think it was fairly apparent that China's road to economic development was always going to be, at best, trying to cherry pick the odd bit of the capitalist system or a market system, a liberal democratic system or economic system, cherry pick those out of expediency because of the results it could deliver, rather than actually genuinely establishing a competitive market in the allocation of capital, for example, or consumer sovereignty by making households sovereign over their spending power, etc. So that goes all the way back, to the reform period. It didn't start with Xi Jinping. I think what Xi Jinping has done has simply just lifted the veil a bit on the direction of travel. And the explanation I would have for that is that increasingly the party state are aware that pinning the entire legitimacy of the governing elite on economic outcomes is highly risky, particularly if you're operating a command economy. And they look at the state of the economy, and it's not just a recent thing. It's, post global financial crisis, you look at the declining capital output ratios, deteriorating capital output ratios. You look at the slowdown in urbanization and the decline in total factor productivity, and the overbuild in property would be a sort of an example of that. And you think, well, actually, God, this is not a great picture. So what Xi Jinping has set out to do, in my view, is redefine the legitimacy of the party along the grounds of national aggrandizement and hence the China dream and national rejuvenation. And so he's preparing the population for a period of economic stagnation or less dramatically, significantly slower growth than they have become accustomed to. And there is a difference, of course, between GDP growth and actually the welfare benefits that necessarily people feel. You can have one without necessarily the other. And so I think that the big bifurcation is that Xi Jinping has started to legitimize party rule based on non-economic factors, such as reunification, China's a centrality in global governance systems, and even sporting prowess. And I think that's the if there is a dividing line between the various general secretaries of the party, it's perhaps that.
Yeah, I guess the question always is Xi Jinping doing things that his predecessors would not have done, and is he only doing them things now because China has the industrial and technological capacity to do them because it's developed since 2000, right? Um, all very interesting stuff. The the question I've got is because I don't think it's covered enough actually, or what is covered is covered selectively. Is Britain's relationship with China? It was kind of interesting. I was going through back and preparing for this interview. I read your book, and Britain has such a strong kind of free trade tradition, right? There was a lovely little quote I'm sure you're familiar with, John Maynard Keynes, who became a bit of an apostate on free trade, which he says, "I was brought up like most Englishmen to respect free trade not only as an economic doctrine, which a rational and instructed person could not doubt, but almost as part of the moral law. I regarded departures from it as being the same as imbecility and an outrage. I thought England's unshakable free trade convictions, maintained for nearly 100 years, to be both the explanation before man and the justification before heaven of her economic supremacy." And then he says in 1933, "Today the orientation of my mind has changed." And it appeals to me because it is so ingrained in the UK, that free trade tradition. Your book came out in 2018. 2 years later, there was Brexit, or what Brexit happened beforehand, but eventually it became a reality. And Boris Johnson gave a speech in Greenwich. Do you remember that one? And it was a classic kind of florid Boris Johnson style speech. And essentially, he was just saying, "Good, we're finally out of the shackles of the EU, and now we can get into the spirit of the old Cobden and Bright spirit of unilateral free trade, and we'll sell beef to China and boomerangs to Australia and all the rest of it." It's actually a little Boris Johnson. I tire of him a little bit, but he does have a talent for some rip roaring speeches, and that is a very one well worth having a read of. But it seems to me that the UK, I don't know, it hasn't. That from a distance at least, it hasn't had the same level of self-reflection that Australia has done with respect to its trading relationship with China. What's your assessment of that?
So, I mean, I think the starting point would be that while the UK was in the European Union, obviously trade policy was not something that we had any control of. So it's a recent thing, and the last government did set about renegotiating or rolling over the trade agreements that we had with the rest of the world outside the EU, and in some cases maybe improving on them a little bit, in other cases maybe not, but and then obviously CPTPP, which I'm not sure whether we actually acceded to it legally yet, but the ground, it's all done other than the signing, if I remember correctly. It is obviously an important thing. But
trade agreement with Australia, it was signed. Was
absolutely. So those are but the reflection on China is interesting because obviously a large part of our economic engagement with China is through Hong Kong, and the discourse on China is really dictated by the Hongs, Jardines and Swires, and the banks, Standard Chartered and HSBC. Those are the big commercial interests that the UK has with China. We have sort of stripped Huawei out of 5G. All that's work in progress, and that's sort of ongoing. But I think it comes back to the sort of city of London, the opportunism, the narrative that China has nurtured, that everyone in the world's economic future is intrinsically aligned with the rise of China, and you're either a part of it or you're not. Obviously, the city is a network, and it depends on a network effect. So, China's desire to duplicate international payment system to help circumvent potential sanctions and messaging systems, its desire to internationalize the RMB, its purported occasional desire to liberalize its capital account. I don't believe it, but the city obviously will have its eyes on the largest savings pool in the world, and obviously China is very astute at cultivating elites around the world and democracies, nurturing the sense that those individuals' economic interests align with China's, and ensuring a degree of compliance with China's wishes in return for the carrot of one day landing this great golden prize. And so, I mean, we've now just had a change of government in the UK, and they've sort of promised an overriding audit of the relationship with China across all domains, which I think will be very interesting to see. And I wouldn't have any preconceptions actually as to how that might turn out. Historically, at least, Labour have not been the party that panders to financial interests. So we'll see how that works, but I don't think that there has been a deep period of reflection on our relationship with China and what we want it to be, and in part that's because we're in a situation where the largest economy in the world, the United States, does not seem to be particularly interested in trading with anyone, allies or foes, or competitors rather. And that doesn't really matter what color of regime you have in America either. I mean, you'd be hard pushed to argue that the Democrats have been more pro-trade than the Republicans under Trump. So, and most of what Trump...
been a massive bipartisan movement on trade since 2016, and you would say that what the bipartisan consensus, Washington consensus, was in 2016 is very different to what it is now. And I'm just struck by that because, ultimately, America is still incredibly economically powerful and culturally powerful, and the UK and Australia as well have still, we're discussing just before we got online, Australia, we have an incredible trading relationship with China. We have a capital account surplus, unlike many industrialized nations. But and we've done some thinking on what the new trade relationship would be, but everyone still pats themselves on the back that we now have, effectively zero tariffs on all manufactured Chinese goods coming into Australia. And we're never a huge industrial power, but we did have an industrial base, whereas the United States was a big industrial base, and it's lost that to China. And the UK and Europe was also, Germany, there were also substantial industrial bases, sectors as well. And yet the idea that the UK would put tariffs on China, or indeed anyone, sort of cuts against that whole, 100-year John Maynard Keynes quote, right? And yet, I don't know, ultimately, that's sort of what you argue in your book, that the West does need to, at the very least on China.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I would draw a distinction between here is, tariffs designed to level a playing field between heavily subsidized producers, and tariffs as a source of revenue raising, which are very different affair. And what I'm sort of disappointed at the lack of progress on is the outside of certain areas like critical materials and the military industrial complex, the lack of cooperation between liberal democracies who are seeing their share of global manufacturing disappear, really. And because cooperation is required if we're going to build an efficient manufacturing alternative to China. I think what we're, and it's going to be incredibly expensive if middle powers go down the route of trying to do it all themselves. We can't have that kind of replication. It just doesn't make any economic sense. So it has to be like-minded countries getting together and creating a free trade area within themselves with a high wall against subsidized or country. It's not just the subsidy, it's the deliberate attempt to create dependencies which compromise the sovereignty of and the freedom of action of the liberal democracies, because that's where we've arrived at, right? When you look at who makes all our PCs and our smartphones and the day-to-day necessities and rare earths and the various critical minerals and what have you, the ability of China to actually close down the economies is there, right? So it's how do we guard against that, but not give up.
Has the UK had the equivalent? I mean, the Americans have had the CHIPS Act, and they've also had tariffs on EVs and a range of other things, and they've had the IRA Act from the Biden administration, Trump's tariffs, which have been, well, he's promising more of them across the board, and particularly additional ones on China. We in Australia haven't touched our tariff regime with respect to China, but we have done some additional industrial policy, and we have the current treasurer is talking about the future made in Australia, where effectively there'll be government throwing a lot of money at the industries, what they think are the industries of the future. Has the UK had, apart from banning Huawei and apart from some additional sort of leveling up type of funding in different parts of UK, there isn't really an equivalent to any of what we've done in Australia and the United States, is there?
No,
today?
No. So I think the UK's approach has been far more targeted on things, what would be considered strategic dependencies, like critical minerals. But there is an attempt to leverage some state capital through financial institutions into supporting industrial development and what have you. But I come back to the point that if China is 20% of the global economy, the rest is 80, right? And you can get the economies of scale required for every industry. I mean, Boeing and Airbus will obviously complain the world is not enough, but apart from them, every industry, the world economy ex China is large enough. And to me, it's about it's creating, realizing that the economics of security are key, are paramount, and that you need to detach market economies from non-market economies in order to continue to grow our productivity and not lose our manufacturing and end up in this position where we have allowed another country with an antithetical set of values to coerce us and to have
the two different approaches that seem to be developing are US style. You have your industrial policy, but you also have your tariff wall. And then the UK and Australian one to different degrees, where you say, we'll just focus on no tariff change to tariff regime with China, but we'll just focus on particular areas, critical minerals, quantum, and we'll let everything else, like I think it's what they're calling it in the military sector, sort of the tall wall, the walled garden approach, where you focus on particular things which you think are of strategic importance, but then you don't care if China makes your toothbrushes and your shirts and your shoes and everything else. Everything else can go hang. And I was reading, and I'm sure you're familiar with him, but Robert Lighthouser, was formerly Trump's U.S. trade representative and maybe the new trade representative, and has got a new book out about trade generally and U.S. specifically, what it should do. And he just makes the point, along with someone like Orrin Cass in the United States with American Compass, is that what they call themselves, Compact, but that's sort of a little bit unrealistic, that approach of the walled garden, because industries develop when you have a whole sort of milieu of industry with people
Yeah.
are tinkering on a whole lot of different things, and certain elements of those will have industrial application. And if you don't accept that sort of that's how things develop, troops need shirts, they need socks, they need shoes, they need toothbrushes anyway. So you have to have a certain base level of industrial capacity, even for military reasons. And so, and if you don't, we in Australia, do we produce our own bicycles? Do we produce our own fish hooks? I don't know anymore, but they're probably not. They're probably all produced in China. And so if the lights go on and there's some sort of conflict, what are you going to do? You can't just say, oh, well, we've got our critical minerals and we've got our greens, but we've got nothing else that we might need, sort of plasma or intravenous needles or everything else. It just seems a very unrealistic kind of approach, because people don't want to shift from that, again,
the mindset. Yeah, the mindset is ingrained.
Of like any deviation from this purest free trade approach is somehow a kind of moral flaw, or that's backward, or they just can't, they really struggle. I've noticed in discussions with people, they really struggle to sort of think we might just have to adjust it in this country. And they just, I haven't seen anyone much in the UK talk about a tariff on Chinese goods, or indeed anyone. And I think that's well beyond the kind of the Overton window of thought in the UK, right? Yeah.
Well, I think part of the reason for that is obviously we've had this inflation shock from COVID. And so no one in sort of policy circles in their right mind is interested in implementing a policy that, at least in the short term, would induce potentially more inflation by adding costs. And so this sort of whole fiscal hole that COVID left us with, I think, has put the debate about how we disengage from China and protect the sort of sense of distributive justice that exists in a market system from contamination by a non-market economy. It's put it on hold. And that's the other thing that I would come back to about, okay, I think you're absolutely right that the sort of sniper approach to critical dependencies is a sort of whack-a-mole game that you have to be ahead of in order for it to be effective, because you've got to be able to predict what the dependencies are going to be years down the line in order to actually not fall into the trap of being vulnerable. Your ecosystem point is I think also very valid, that innovation comes from doing, and that if you don't have that core industrial base within the free world, then we're always just going to be imitating and playing catch up. But the thing that I think one of the other impacts of this economic engagement and the depth of the economic engagement with the non-market economy has been the very real sense of distributive injustice that has been created. So, if I'm an entrepreneur and I sink my balance sheet into building something, a business, and then my intellectual property is stolen and I'm wiped out, there's no one compensating me for that. I'm the victim of a crime. But if I'm a worker at the other end of the scale, I'm just a factory worker somewhere in Germany, and suddenly the company I work for has been crippled because the Chinese state is subsidizing someone in China to just eat my lunch. Then I'm unemployed and my lifestyle collapses. And again, it's through no fault of my own. There's no, I did everything right. I was in a market sense the leader, and I've been unseated by non-market practices. And so again, to restore that sense of the moral authority of a market system, you can't do that by just becoming more like China, and replicating Chinese industrial policy, but probably less effectively and on a smaller scale. What, to my mind, you have to build the moat around the market-orientated economies, and let the market economies, economic agents within the market economies compete against each other within a free trade environment. But by doing so, by putting up the moat between the non-market economies and the market ones, you then restore the sense of moral justice that comes with a market-orientated system.
You grew up in which part of England, Stuart? Did you?
Not England, actually. Edinburgh, Scotland.
Edinburgh, yeah, okay. And have you seen? Because again, Australia, we did have an industrial sector, we did have a car industry, but we have benefited so much because of the fact that we have these riches, blessed with these riches of iron ore and coal and gas, most of which end up to China one way or another. And we haven't experienced to the same extent the sort of rust belts and areas of deindustrialization that the UK and the United States have had. What should we? I actually asked John Mearsheimer, who's that foreign policy professor and has a reputation, and is a realist of the realist school, has a reputation as being a bit of a hard kind of amoral type of guy, but he's not. He's just, that's his particular view of the way the world works. And I asked him what Australia's trading relationship should be with China, and he said, "Well, you guys should just sell them as much stuff as possible. You should be focusing on and get really close to the United States strategically, because we'll secure your, provide your security." And that's, I don't know. I mean, he's an academic ultimately. He hasn't had sort of that real world experience. I have some major sort of criticisms of that. What do you think? What should Australia's trade policy? We have benefited a lot from it all. We haven't quite experienced the same downside. Are we foolish to even talk about should we just ride the wave and not worry about making anything much here manufacturing wise?
Well, you can sell them as much as you like, and that's not mutually exclusive from developing your own manufacturing base. That's about what you buy from them and at what terms you buy from them.
Yeah.
So if the iron ore exports, the only people who are going to buy iron ore from anyone are people who make steel. And if China makes all the steel, you've got no choice but to sell the iron ore to the people who are making the steel, right?
Yeah.
But the question is, why are they making the steel? Is that a market efficient outcome? They don't have any water. They don't have the iron ore. There's no reason why their electricity would necessarily be cheaper than anyone else's, and particularly not if you put in some carbon emission kind of price on their electricity. So where's their competitive advantage in steel? There is none. It's just a state sort of national power sort of policy to produce that. You can sell them the lithium. I mean, that's your growth market, right? But where does that go? To electric batteries? Wouldn't you rather make the electric batteries? Or not? I mean, but the point I would be making here is that if you continue to have tariff-free access to your own market from China for manufactured goods, their scale means that they will always beat you at it.
Yeah. I mean, there was.
So you're then accepting the fact that they are going to shape the structure of your economy, and then are you prepared to put yourself in a position where they can switch off your export streams? I mean, obviously they have problems diversifying their supply as well. And one of the interesting points I would make is that, given the geopolitical tensions the last few years, it's interesting how little China has been able to diversify its supply of iron ore away from Brazil and Australia, because you're the people who make it on scale. But all this BRI and buying mines in China, in Africa, it's made really not a jot of difference on the iron ore front. Who knows what will happen in lithium sort of going forward? but I think I'm right in saying that Australia's lithium exports to China account for about 60% of China's imports of lithium. So, you know, they are hooked on you as well. And so I think that, I think it'd be misplaced to believe that Australia should head towards autarky, or that Australia should be trying to replicate an industrial base with the sort of diversity that China has in terms of the number of products and industries and things. Obviously, it's not a large enough market to support that. It's you know, on its own, but in conjunction with like-minded countries, it's part of an informal alliance system of countries that share certain values that does offer scale and a market size that is large enough to sustain every industry that China currently dominates. And it's really about breaking that mindset that, you know, if you're in favor of protecting a set of economies from China, that makes you a protectionist. What we're trying to protect is actually our sovereignty of values and the distributive justice that comes with the market system.
I think that some of those terms like autarky and protectionist and stuff, they're epithets. They don't actually they impede critical thinking about it. You know, it's more about realism on trade, you know, not utopianism on trade. And you know, I always say it's you know, it wouldn't have made sense for the Athenians to have the Persians make all their ships, right? You know, obviously that doesn't, free trade wouldn't have made sense in those circumstances. At some level, there are national interests that you need to maintain. And the situation you described, where, you know, we continue to send all our minerals to China and rely on the Americans for security, is sort of not something a self-respecting nation should allow, because you do lose control of your destiny to a certain extent. And I just don't.
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, look at some of the smaller countries in the neighborhood who are more dependent on China for trade and investment and sort of other economic engagement than you. And you know, okay, they're small, but look at Laos, look at Cambodia. You know, these countries really have lost their freedom of action, I think, diplomatically, because the ability of China to impose such heavy costs on them if they were to stray from the path that China would like them to take is clearly there. And I think that you know, China is very different from the United States in the sense that the United States, just in terms of trade patterns, trades so heavily with Mexico and Canada that it actually trades very little with the rest of the world, given the size of its economy. Okay, and obviously trade to GDP is lower in the United States than China anyway, right?
Yeah.
What China is very good at doing is cultivating a diversity of supply chains wherever possible, a diversity of suppliers wherever possible, iron ore being a place where they've tried and not necessarily succeeded, and cultivating these incredibly asymmetric trading relationships where, you know, yes, they would, you know, if Australia turned around and said, we're not sending you any iron ore, it would impose a cost on China. Absolutely it would. But at the end of the day, they will be able to substitute, you know, scale back, you know, steel or whatever.
We go broke overnight. If that happened, probably.
Exactly. So the asymmetry is inbuilt in the relationship, and you know, I think that's where middle powers, and this is why I hold out, rightly or wrongly, a lot of hope for the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, is that there isn't a superpower involved, and you know, here are a collection of countries that hopefully are prepared to really engage in free trade on a basis of reciprocity and enhancing economic welfare, but with, you know, a group of countries where there's a large element of symmetry in the trading relationship, because you simply don't have the EU or the United States or China that is so disproportionately large to everything else in the world. The trading relationships inevitably give rise to an element of coercion or coercion.
Yeah, clearly, Australia's trading. The closer a society is, both socioeconomically, culturally, politically, the closer trading relationship you can have. You know, Australia trading with New Zealand is different. Australia trading with China. But at the moment, we kind of have a closer trading relationship with China than Australia. It's easy to import and export goods from Australia and China that is from Australia to France, right? And I think that doesn't make complete sense. And ultimately, the closer, as the UK experience shows, right? If you do get really close and is part of a common market or very, very close trading relationships, there's an inexorable demand to get closer, ever closer political union of some description, or ever closer alignment in regulations and everything else. And you do lose control over your own distinctive political culture and rulemaking sort of power. I mean, you're out of it now, but it was always a surprise to me. I don't think Australians fully got the fact that how much power the UK had actually ceded to the EU and over the years. So
no, that's right, and it really only I don't think many people in the United Kingdom did either, actually, until it came to disentangling oneself from it, right? And then it all became too obvious. I mean, one of the best arguments against the sort of sovereignty reason for leaving the European Union, I can't remember the gentleman's name now, but I think he was responsible actually for writing Article 54, whatever it was, that was the mechanism by which you triggered leaving. And his argument was, well, you haven't lost your sovereignty because you can leave anytime you like, and therefore that's the proof that you haven't lost your sovereignty. But of course, when we did come to leave, we found out that we couldn't really leave anytime we liked. It was a very fraught and complicated unpicking process that had to go through.
And I guess the day-to-day exercise of sovereignty, if you can't, in theory, while you have that out, the day-to-day rule-making power is also an exercise in real sovereignty too. And if you don't have that, then it's not the same as you are now in any event. Hey, I won't keep you too long, because I know you were saying it's a beautiful day there in the UK, and
it doesn't happen very often.
Exactly. But what books or authors are you following or reading that have a more critical view on trade generally, or China investment relation in particular?
Right. Well, there's a great literature in economic statecraft from sort of Baldwin, and then War by Other Means, which I think was published by the CFR, the Council for Foreign Relations in America. Aaron Friedberg at Princeton writes extensively about the great power competition. And then, some of my colleagues at the Heinrich Foundation have written extensively about tech nationalism and the bifurcation of the tech world and data, digital trade, and sort of the political element to that. And obviously, when it comes to data, privacy and the use of data for national means as opposed to commercial means, clearly the type of political regime that you're dealing with is imperative, right, in determining the structure of the rules potentially. So I think they've been doing some very good work on that. Yeah, I'm encouraged by, and then I think it was an Australian, actually, is it Clive Hamilton, who with another author has written extensively about China's influence operations and the United Front.
I reviewed his book for the Center for Independent Studies and spoke to him, and those guys. I mean, I'm familiar with them, and they have pros and cons, on the whole thing.
Yeah, but what I am really encouraged by and is the amount of stuff and the range of domains in which people are waking up to the fact that China poses a threat. Whether that's the Internet of Things, an internet module, the modules that connect your lawnmower robot to the internet, probably made in China, that the threats to critical national infrastructure, the whole cyber world, and the malign nature of China's activities in the cyber world. I'm talking there about critical national infrastructure, but obviously then you've got the social media space and the influence operations in terms of gerrymandering popular opinion and the ability to divide populations, undermine their morale, etc. I mean, it really is. I do feel that we are in a war by another name.
Yeah, I think ultimately though we're in alignment. Some of those things are some of those. Well, who knows, right? What the future ultimately holds, but I feel sometimes those guys, hawkish China guys, of which I am one to a certain extent, they ignore the trade side. They think we can just build up a military, and I like that line from JD Vance, who, whatever you think of the Republicans and the Trump and all the rest of it, is a thoughtful guy, right? And his line that the worst of all possible worlds is for China to make all our stuff and to go to war with China. What you want to have a situation is that we don't go to war, we gradually disengage, we build up our own sovereign industrial capacity, so we're not so entwined, like so in that oft repeated line of deeper engagement with China. We just push back a bit, like we don't we
well, the other
we
point I'd
don't.
make here is that we can take a lot of the world with us, if you like, on this, because I think there's an increasing realization in ASEAN and in other middle powers, Turkey, for example, Latin America, that China's industrial rise has not been a boon for them. It has actually come at their expense. And that if these countries are actually going to develop and substantially raise their living standards, they need to do it through manufacturing. They need the economies of scale and the productivity growth that comes with that. And that the sort of US, and I would hope that it's more than US, decoupling from China on the trade front, is a heaven-sent opportunity for these countries to build industrial bases of their own that will snowball and lead to greater development for them. And at the moment, one can't avoid the suspicion that a lot of what's going on is that Chinese companies in manufacturing investing in Vietnam and Mexico and what have you to circumvent the tariffs.
Yeah.
But that's a start, because that's the beginnings of the decoupling, because then it's in those countries' interests to demand that more value is created in their own countries and that the vertical integration takes place in their countries. And then before you know it, you've got an industrial cluster that is standing on its own 2 feet, not in China. And so, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think that the speed of the direct trade decoupling between China and the United States is happening much faster and at less cost than people thought it would. There was the vested interest in saying, oh, it's all too big, it's too big a problem, it'd be too expensive, there's nothing we can do about it. It turns out there is. The next phase is perhaps taxing Chinese content, tightening up rules of origin, etc., to ensure that there is vertical integration going on in these countries in the global south that have been inclined to lean towards China, or at least try and bridge both camps, as they realize that it's actually in their interests to build. If they're going to progress, they need manufacturing to do it. And taking it from China is the way forward for them.
Yeah, great stuff. Like I said, I won't keep you. Stewart Paterson, author of China Trade Power, and can people follow your work elsewhere or check in with?
So I write for the Heinrich Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization promoting sustainable trade. Which is based out of Singapore, and all their work is free to read. It's available on their website, which is just the Heinrich Foundation. They can, and the book is available at all good bookshops or online.
I can recommend it. Great to speak to you, and enjoy your English summer.
Thanks very much, Dan. Cheers.
See ya. Bye.
Okay.